It was one of those mornings that felt heavy before it even began. The sun barely peeked over the horizon, its pale light stretching weakly across the cracked pavement outside the small diner on the edge of town. Inside, the smell of burnt coffee and cheap grease filled the air, and behind the counter stood Lena Carter, a young woman whose hands moved on instinct while her heart lived somewhere far away, buried beneath exhaustion and quiet resignation. Her apron was stained, her eyes tired, but it wasn't the kind of tired that sleep could fix. It was the kind of tired that comes from carrying a dream too long, only to realize you might never have the strength, or the money, to chase it. Before we continue, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of doing good, then please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness. It helps stories like this reach more hearts. Lena had grown up in that very town, a place that time seemed to forget. Her mother had passed away when she was 17, and her father, once a mechanic with a gentle soul, had been taken by illness 2 years later. After that, she was alone, juggling part-time jobs to pay for rent, food, and the never-ending list of bills that kept appearing like shadows. Yet, beneath all that weight, there lived one small, fragile thing, a dream. She had always wanted to study art. As a child, she'd spend hours drawing on the backs of old receipts or cardboard boxes, turning scraps into worlds. She used to believe she'd go to college in the city one day, learn from real artists, and maybe even open a little studio of her own. But dreams, she learned, cost money. Tuition, supplies, rent, all the things she could never afford. So, she told herself to forget. To bury the dream deep inside, where it wouldn't hurt so much. Still, on her lunch breaks, she would sit outside the diner with a pencil and an old notebook, sketching quietly. Faces of customers, passing cars, the stray cat that always lingered by the trash bins. It was her one piece of magic in a world that had turned dull. One cold November morning, a man walked into the diner. He looked out of place, his coat was too clean for this side of town, and his shoes looked like they'd never touched dirt. Ethan Miller, a software designer from Chicago, had stopped by after his car broke down a few miles away. He sat at the counter, scrolling through his phone while waiting for a mechanic, unaware that fate had just placed him exactly where he needed to be. Lena poured his coffee with her usual polite smile, but something about her caught Ethan's attention, the calm steadiness of her movements, the flicker of something fragile in her eyes. He watched as she stepped outside during her break, sitting on the curb with her sketchbook open. The way she drew wasn't casual, it was deliberate, alive. It was as if she was trying to capture the soul of everything she touched. Curiosity tugged at him. When she came back in, he asked, "You draw?" She hesitated, not used to strangers noticing. "Just, for myself," she murmured. He smiled, "You're really good. You ever think about doing it professionally?" Her laugh was quiet but sharp. "I can't afford dreams," she said simply, then walked away to take another order. That sentence lingered with Ethan long after he left the diner. "I can't afford dreams." It echoed in his mind like a melody that refused to fade. He had grown up with every opportunity, a supportive family, a good education, a stable job. Yet, despite all his success, something in his life felt hollow. And here was this girl, fighting every day just to survive, yet still holding on to her gift, however quietly. A week later, his car was fixed, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. He kept coming back to the diner, always sitting at the same seat by the window, ordering the same coffee, watching Lena work. Over time, they talked more. He learned that she lived alone in a one-room apartment, that she walked to work every day, and that she'd never been farther than the next town over. Ethan saw something in her that reminded him of what life used to mean before everything became about money and deadlines. She was raw, real, and utterly unaware of her own light. And somewhere along the way, he made a silent promise, to help her see what he saw. He began small. He left her a set of quality sketch pencils one morning with a note that simply said, "Keep drawing." A week later, he brought her a portfolio book. At first, she resisted, embarrassed by the attention, suspicious of his kindness. But eventually, she accepted, mostly because she didn't know how to refuse a gesture that felt so pure. When Ethan asked to see her sketches, she reluctantly showed him. He was stunned. Her drawings weren't just good, they were extraordinary. She captured emotion in a way that made you feel. A wrinkled hand holding a coffee mug. A stray dog sleeping under a flickering streetlight. The world as seen by someone who paid attention to what most people ignored. He suggested she apply for a local art scholarship he'd read about, but she shook her head. "I don't even have the money for the application fee," she said softly. "And besides, they wouldn't pick someone like me." Ethan didn't argue. Instead, he quietly paid her application fee himself and convinced her to submit her portfolio. She almost didn't. She almost gave up again, until one evening, after a long shift, she found a message in her inbox. "Congratulations, you've been selected for an interview." Lena froze. It was the first time in years that something good had chosen her. The night before the interview, she stood in front of the mirror, wearing a plain white blouse borrowed from a coworker. Her hands trembled. She looked at her reflection and barely recognized the woman staring back, scared, hopeful, alive. The next morning, Ethan drove her to the city. As they crossed the bridge, Lena looked out the window, watching the skyline rise like a promise. She'd never seen anything so big, so full of possibility. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine, what if? The interview went better than she expected. They asked about her inspiration, her background, her dreams. When they asked why she wanted to study art, she paused and said quietly, "Because it's the only thing that's ever made me feel like I matter." A week later, she received the email that changed everything. She'd been accepted, with a full scholarship. She sat on the floor of her small apartment, the letter trembling in her hands as tears rolled down her cheeks. She had never cried like that before, not out of pain, but out of pure, overwhelming relief. When Ethan came by that evening, she didn't say a word. She just ran to him, wrapped her arms around him, and whispered through tears, "You made it come true." Over the next few months, Lena's life transformed. She moved to the city, started her classes, and for the first time, she felt like she belonged somewhere. She struggled, late nights, part-time jobs, endless deadlines, but now her exhaustion carried meaning. Every brushstroke, every sketch, every critique brought her closer to the life she'd always imagined. Ethan stayed in touch, visiting whenever he could. He watched her grow, watched her confidence bloom. Sometimes they'd meet in a small park near her campus, and she'd show him her latest work. He never took credit for any of it. To him, he had only nudged open a door, she was the one who walked through it. Years passed. Lena graduated with honors. Her artwork began to gain attention, first locally, then nationally. She started her own small gallery, Second Light, named after the moment her life began again. It became a place not just for her art, but for young dreamers who couldn't afford their own dreams. She gave them a place to start. On the night of her first major exhibit, she stood under soft golden lights, surrounded by paintings that told her story, the diner, the sketches, the quiet moments of hope. Reporters came, people congratulated her, but her eyes searched for one face. When she finally saw him standing at the back of the crowd, smiling, she felt tears well up again. After the event, they sat outside under the same stars that had watched over her all those lonely nights. She turned to him and said, "I used to think I wasn't meant for more. That some people just weren't born lucky. But you proved me wrong." Ethan smiled gently. "You just needed someone to remind you that you deserve to dream." And in that quiet moment, with the city lights glowing behind them, she realized that sometimes the greatest kindness isn't in giving money or gifts, it's in giving someone belief. So many people go through life thinking they can't afford to dream. But sometimes, all it takes is one person who refuses to let you give up, one heart that believes when you can't. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, comment, and subscribe to Kindness. It helps us spread stories that remind the world how powerful compassion can be. And before we end, comment below and tell us, has anyone ever believed in you when you couldn't believe in yourself? Because maybe, just maybe, your story could be the one that helps someone else find their dream again. Moral: kindness doesn't always change the world at once, but it can change someone's entire world.